it almost seems like the different writers of the Gospels, it's almost like those differences come up in a sense of interpretation of events. Maybe like how we talked about before, people can go to the same place but have a different interpretation of the same event, but more emphasis on one thing or another.
So, for example, all three of us were in an event. I write about specifically details about the event, and maybe in that event there is a band, but I never write that there is a band. But maybe you write that there is a band,
Right.
or and then Jose could write that there is a people doing art, crafts, and so forth. Doesn't necessarily imply that I'm contradicting Jose or you, but rather that we're looking at it from a different view. And we
Yeah.
have to see that from the Gospels as well, because Matthew was looking at it from a different view than Luke was.
It
Yeah.
was also writing to a different crowd.
That's true. And they all have different lives. And maybe I
Right.
picked up on something that you didn't pick up on. And when you put them together, though, then it starts to make sense, as we've been kind of mentioning. And then also, like, the idea of, like, oh, they kind of, what they took from Jesus' sacrifice was to fight the devil. Maybe someone else took something else from the sacrifice, that he was doing it for another reason. And so I don't see that as a contradiction. I just see it as people experiencing and interpreting the events of Jesus in different ways.
It was an oral tradition, so not a lot of things were written. And then at that time period, we don't have that much record of a lot of historical figures. As he points out with Alexander the Great, we know a lot of his information 200 to 300 years right after his death. Compare that to Jesus, who was, maybe 30. You could even conclude that Mark was in AD 60, but still that's 30 years, 28 years after his death, which is pretty close. Compare that to, for example, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and so forth. So the closeness of the Gospels to Jesus is, it doesn't compare to, for example, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar.
It's the same process of, in terms of how it was recorded in history. So it's like, well, if we're going to question Jesus, why don't we question the same process that was used for Caesar and Alexander? I mean,
When was Jesus born, right? Because, Matthew says, he was born in 1 year. Another one says he was born in another year. And then I think there was also questions in terms of, Herod being, still alive. What was he really alive? Was there really a persecution?
The main argument is that in Matthew, we see that Jesus is born in the late years of Herod. And in Luke, there's mention of the first census that was done by a governor at that time by the name of Quirinius. Quirinius was a governor after Herod's death. So that's mentioned by Eusebius, who was a historian in the first century. So the skeptic would say, well, if Jesus was born during the late times of Herod, but then in the other gospel, he mentions that he was born during the governorship of Quirinius, that means that it's contradicting itself. I think we have to look at the Gospels, and more specifically the New Testament, as people who are not specifically trying to put evidence in every single thing. Their objective in the Gospels is to bring the good news. So obviously, if they're going to give something such as, a birth or a scenario, they're not going to go so much deep toe in it, because obviously the whole message of the gospel was to bring the good news. What we could find also is that there is a connection between that of Matthew and that of Luke. Scholars have pointed out that whenever Luke 2:2, where it reads that, the first census that was done by Quirinius, the term first doesn't really refer to first, but rather before. The term is used as the genitive Greek case as protos, which, by the way, means before, as it's also mentioned in John 1:15, John 1:30, and John 15:18. This is also proposed by scholars such as N.T. Wright, and also Oxford scholars such as Liddell Scott, as well as the Greek English lexicon of the New Testament by Barr. So technically speaking, if that's the case, then it would match up with the Gospel of Matthew, because the census was done before the governorship of Quirinius. So a lot of scholars have pointed out that the term first is misguided. It rather, protos, which is the Greek, is actually referred to before, not first.
It's kind of interesting how the translation came to come across as first primer, because I have a Spanish Bible, and it also says first or primer. How would you say, like, I mean, somebody that doesn't speak Greek and just kind of picks up the Bible, how are they supposed to know that? I mean, I'm sure that through research they can come to the same conclusion, right? But to somebody that's just reading it and says like, well, I didn't know, like, why does it say first then here? Why haven't they changed?
Where goes to my other argument that scholars have pointed out. So the term that is used first in Luke actually signifies an historical time period. First means is the first census, but clearly in Roman times, specifically in the book of the deeds of Augustus, there were several censuses that were done not only during the time of the governorship of Quirinius, but they were also done way before. So whenever they were referred to the first census, they were referred to the first census under him, but there was also other censuses that were going on throughout the BC era or AD, which again, BC and AD are things that are made later on in order to have some form of connection within history. But in the early era, there was no such thing as AD or BC.
Is there a time or a date where Herod actually lived, like an actual, does that go coincide with Jesus's birth?
During his late years, that's when Jesus was born. And then after that, in the beginning of AD is when Quirinius became governor. So Herod was in the late BC during the times of Jesus' birth, but then he died before the governorship of Quirinius. That's how we know that from Josephus. And a lot of times, a lot of people who look at the New Testament, they look at certain words and have to go back to the Greek in order to identify certain, translations. Because obviously, when you're translating the Greek to the English, it doesn't translate the exact same words. There's 2, 3 meanings, 4 meanings. So in all those meanings, it's also referring to not only as governor, but also as leader or chief. And somehow the bigger question is, I mean, how do we know that prophecy exists? Well, that's actually a different question. But from an historical point of view, the prophecy that is found in the Old Testament from a typological form is the reason why they had to go to Bethlehem, which is the lineage of Joseph, to be honest, because Joseph is from Bethlehem. And that's the reason why he also had to go back to Bethlehem in order to do the census, because obviously, if you're originally from a country, during the census, you have to go and, do the census with your household and so forth and your original home.
Why didn't Mary just stay and do the census in Nazareth, since she's in Nazareth? Why did she have to go with Joseph?
It's mostly done by prophecy that was found in the Old Testament to the New. So whenever I mentioned the Magi's went to Herod and said, like, why are you here? I come to see the Christ. And the ones who were near Herod, who were the scribes or the Pharisees, were telling him, it's is Christ who was prophesied in the Old Testament. So even in the New Testament, it's referring to going back to the prophecy of the Old Testament.
The person asking if there are other writings, except because they were saying it was only recorded in the Gospels and stuff like that.
We have from non-Christian sources Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, and Flavius of Josephus. Now, he mentions that Josephus' accounts of Jesus was corrupted. I just don't see that anywhere where it's corrupted, because obviously if he assumes that Josephus' accounts are corrupted, then he will also has to refer to his argument about the census of Josephus to be corrupted as well, and other writings of Josephus to be corrupted. So, but I wouldn't say that Josephus was corrupted the same way as I wouldn't say that he was corrupted in him giving the census of Quirinius. I think it all comes together.
The commentator was pointing out that Jesus could not do mighty work in his hometown, I believe, where they knew him as family, and that he decided not to do it, not because it was because of how they received him and he could just not do miracles for some reason, because there's a handful of people not believing him to be a god. And so they're questioning, well, if he's omnipotent and he's powerful, then why can't he perform miracles whenever he wants to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the Gospel of Matthew himself, he also, for example, whenever he doesn't do some miracles, he knows exactly the other individual's heart and mind. I think that's in a way a miracle, because obviously human beings cannot read minds or cannot read hearts. So we kind of have to look back and say, okay, maybe it's not some miracle where he could turn water into wine, but it's something that he could read thoughts, or he could read the heart, which is something that humans don't have the capacity to do. Not only that, but Jesus and throughout the other gospels does miracles left and right. He feeds